Investment based in Bethesda. I also serve as Executive Director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, and my work in Africa has taken me to live in the Republic of Benin, West Africa, where I lived for a few years with Africare, opened up the office Africare Benin, and also was a guest of President of Togo at the time, the dictator Eyadema, which gave us an intake, a good take on things back then, as inquisitive young ambassadors from Howard University at the time. My love for Africa is strong, and have friends throughout the region, throughout the continent, and continue to do a lot of work in the region of the Caribbean. So thank you very much for coming this afternoon. Distinguished panel. So as we watch democracy grow, we'll be talking this afternoon on encouraging economic growth and prosperity across Africa. We have a very distinguished panelists group set forth for this afternoon. I say this is my chic group because they seem to have communicated either telepathically or through other social media and said, you know, listen, we are getting the best dressed group of panelists for this afternoon. So having said that, I want to take the opportunity to introduce our first speaker. We'll be introducing each speaker. Our first speaker is Ms. Sylvia Stannard. She is with the DC Volunteer Coordinator at Youth for Human Rights International. I do not have much more about her background. She will give us a little bit more. She brought us a wonderful tape of a PSA from her organization. Unfortunately, we cannot get it up. So what I may do, in the interest of time, do we have a techie here that can assist us in trying to give it like 2 more seconds or 2 more minutes in terms of trying to work it? Do we have any of our volunteers? Consider yourself a techie. In this, they say no one wants to take a chance. So Sylvia, if you would, what we cannot do through video, you'll be able to do in person and through voice. So with that, I want to welcome you. Please help me welcome in Sylvia Stannard to the mic.
Okay, good. So I am with a group called Youth for Human Rights, and there are some pamphlets that are free for people to take over there. And what Youth for Human Rights does is it very strongly believes that education is really critical. And knowing about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was passed by the United Nations in 1948. So if I went out and surveyed a group, this group here, and asked you, what are your human rights? I guarantee you that nobody can rattle off all of the 30 human rights that you would have guaranteed under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Most people know 2 or 3 rights and they think those are their human rights, but actually under international law and under this international agreement, there are 30 different rights that everyone has. And so what Youth for Human Rights has done, because it is a youth program and aimed towards younger people, is it has taken the legal document, which is kind of an intensive legal document, and tried to make it more simple using youth actors, youth settings, that kind of thing, to make it very real and something that people can use in schools, in educational settings, to teach what are human rights. For instance, one of the rights is the right to public assembly. So in the video, so there's a 30-second little public service announcement on each of the rights. So in the video, you have youth who are at a rally who are doing something. So it shows youth participating in the system. And interestingly enough, for this conference, one of the rights that's actually agreed to in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that has almost 195 countries agreed to it is the right to democracy. So it's actually one of the rights that are guaranteed under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The right to participate in your government. So it's not just protecting your own personal rights, but protecting your community's rights. Because if we don't respect and protect the human rights of ourselves, our brothers, our community, then nobody's rights are respected. And that is where it often falls into a problem, particularly in Africa, and a lot of other countries as well. Africa, Venezuela's got problems, a lot of countries have problems, is when you have people that rise up into power, into government power, who don't respect the rights and treat the rights of their citizens as very, very important. And I think they're very short-sighted in doing that, because that is where you then have public unrest, you have riots, you have attempted coups, you have things that people will take their motions to the street because they're not being given their rights. So it's actually in the government's self-interest to respect the rights of their own citizens and to treat their citizens fairly and equally. So what the whole program is, what we do is teach people what their human rights are. And we have free available, they can just get this on the website, Youth for Human Rights. So if there's any teachers in the audience or teachers watching, they can go online and ask for the educator kit and get a free educator kit sent to them. And what this does is it has lesson plans and examples and things that can be done on each of the human rights that really show you what your human rights are. And what we found is that in doing this, particularly with youth, because I think that's where we have to make the change. We have to make the change with youth. As the societies are coming up in the United States, everywhere else, you have to communicate to youth, you have to get them active, you have to get them aware of some of these issues, because a lot of people just sit there and watch TV all day or do other things, and they're not really focusing on what's happening to the country, what's happening to the community they're in. But if they're really activated and made aware of it, they become more tolerant, there's less bullying, they become more accepting of others because they want their rights respected. Well, part of that is it's not just a one-way flow. It's not just, I should have my rights and therefore I can trample your rights. But to have my rights, that means I have to respect everyone else's rights. So that, the more we can teach that and get that out into the community, into all the communities, into African communities, into the United States, into everywhere, the more I think we're going to have a more peaceful society. And it's not easy, it's not without bumps, but again, the more youth learn to respect other people's rights, hopefully they're not going to do things like taking up guns and this kind of thing. What we've done in Africa with this program is there was African Youth for Human Rights group that was created in Liberia, and what they've done is they've actually gone out into the villages and into areas where there were former child soldiers, many of whom were in jail, or many of whom felt very, their lives were over. They committed so many atrocities against their own people, against their own families, that they felt there was nothing they could do. And they started working with these young men, mostly young men, to get them to teach human rights to others. And it really opened them up, where they felt like they're giving back to the society, there's something they can do. And it's been very, very successful of teaching them and promoting through the schools and promoting through rehabilitation programs in Rwanda, in Liberia, and other countries, on just teaching human rights and using some of the human rights abusers, if they are interested and can see the value of this, to actually go out and start teaching human rights and promoting human rights to others. So that is what we're doing, and very interested in having people go to the youthforhumanrights.com or humanrights.com, and they can order materials for free and use it, because it's just getting it out there. It is from the United Nations, so it is the most universally recognized declaration of what are your human rights. So if you don't know what your human rights are, you certainly can't defend them or support them for others. So step one is sort of knowing what they are. It's kind of a basic bottom line, and from there we can build a better society, we hope. So that's what we're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Sylvia. So our next speaker is John is an academic, journalist, and consultant with an international development organization. He worked for various Kenyan newspapers as a columnist, taught at the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and in South Korea. Interests include the role of social capital in education and governance in development. Keen observer of developments in Africa. Okay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Moon. Join me.
Introduced to economics, development economics in my A-level class by a gentleman known as Sir Arthur Lewis, who happens to come from one of those small countries in St. Lucia. First title was, of course, something to do with stages of economic growth. It was very linear. You know, you moved from one stage to the next, and it was so clear, schematic, and I thought that's how the world should go. And I also then was introduced to politics through the study of the British government. And I do recall that in my A-level course and then examination, there was always one question you knew was bound to be on the test, or a variant of it. It always said, it was a quotation of Sir Walter Beckwith. The king or the queen reigns, does not rule, discuss. So, answering that question appears easy, but to arrive at the point at how, where the king is no longer ruling but reigning, you have to study the whole of the British history. Combine that introduction to politics and economics later on at college, then you enter the realm of political economy. I was introduced to political economy through a structuralist by the name of Karl Marx. And I was an ardent Marxist, almost a hot branch. I'm not so sure that I've entirely sponged myself with the Marxist analysis, but again, that was a very clear analysis of how societies develop, how capital is accumulated, and how politics and the economy are intertwined. Fast forward 30 years later, what my experience, I've gone through the school of hard knocks, I've looked at societies, and there are no clear answers anymore about how societies ought to develop, how they develop. Because if somebody tells you that they have the answers truly, they may think they do, but the reality is much more complex and murky. I'm engaged in a number of things. One of the hearts of where is looking at how developing societies are attempting to transition from the state they are in to what everybody calls democratic societies. I think in the practitioners of people trying to bring about change in the so-called natural order societies are moving away from the use of the word democracy, because it is, for all practical purposes, all-encompassing and also means very little. And I've refined it in a manner that indicates exactly the attributes of societies that are considered democratic, but with a much bigger or more refined definition. And I think the classification that I use is based on binaries: open access societies and closed societies, or natural order societies. That's the fellow who came up with that classification is none other than the famous Professor Douglas North. And I think it makes sense. If you adopt that paradigm, if you adopt that scheme of looking at how societies are constituted, social orders are still in the world, then you can move on and say, okay, how did some societies reach the level of open access? What happened? What happened? And throughout the world has got about 170, 80 some countries, but according to this classification, only about 20 of those countries are actually truly open access societies. And that's mostly the Western world. And contrary to the pessimism expressed, for example, about the United States because of what it's going through now, a lot of people consider this period a useful test for how open the United States as a society is. And I think so far it has passed the test. If there's a stress test, an institutional stress test, the United States is actually doing pretty well. It doesn't worry me because I think the institutions are holding. And it's another example of how the measure of the strength of open access societies. And they are open access because there's all this there's an institutional framework that allows all the rights, for example, that the previous speakers talked about. Despite what may be going on, whatever, I am free as an individual to walk out here and begin to shout to all manner of obscenities against whoever I don't like down the road. You'll pass by and probably say this for the cuckoo, but I'm not going to be, no one is going to, the police is not going to come and say, why am I saying this? Because this society is still open access society. And my bet is that it's going to survive. It's going to survive the stress test that comes. Now let's now look at Africa. There is no single African country that's open access. All of them are to a measure closed societies. So how are they closed vis-a-vis open society? And I always look at going back again to the history of the British government that I learned. How did the British system become open? Because that is the first system on earth to become an open access society. And if anyone who has got some acquaintance with the British history will know that there was no revolution in England.
Magna Carta.
There was no, there was no physical, but somehow the society evolved to an open access society. How did that happen? The key and the answer lies in the elite formation in Britain. How did the elite manage to navigate, over time, broadly open up the system, continue recruiting people into the elite, and also ensuring collective enforcement of certain norms, particularly to do with acquisition and maintaining of private property, because that is the key. That's how. The moment the British elite were able to force the monarchy, to force that you cannot appropriate property, anyone's property in the kingdom, that was the beginning of open access society in Britain. And up to today, it's referred to as the mother of democracy in broad terms, but essentially it was the beginning of the rule of law agreed upon by the elite, not the masses. I take a contrast because there's a lot of talk about the masses and how the masses drive history. I'm of the opinion they don't. The masses never drive history. It is the elite that drives history. And it's what the elite decide to do that will determine the fate of a country. In Africa now, if you look at it, the elite across the continent adhere to certain norms of behavior. Where they are right now, they agree that, okay, collectively, they will restrain individual use of violence by the various factions of the elite to give them space to collect rent from the rest of the country. That's what they do. And if any one of them, one of the elite, one of the members of that elite goes outside that agreement, the full force of the other elite come on them. And they will drive them out. When Savimbi tries to change the system using violence and doesn't agree to, divvying up the natural resources, they'll kill you. Or if you're a clever elite, member of the elite, like in Kenya or Gingo Dinga, you shake hands with them. That's the only way. You either fight them or you shake hands with them. And hopefully, as you do that, and over time, the system progresses and the elite become more enlightened. Now, you notice, I'm not saying that this will happen, inevitably happen. Nobody knows. Sometimes it will happen, sometimes it will not. And one of the reasons, for example, South Sudan, the example that's always been given, is that there was no sufficient time for the elite to coalesce and have any norms. So from the get-go, they were fighting over allocation of resources. And they control, individually they control instruments of violence. So how does this tie in with democracy in Africa? To conclude, I'm not a pessimist. But the key to Africa's salvation will lie on where the elite of the continent will decide to take it. If they do not, somehow they do not transition, the danger is they can actually stagnate. And I have examples. The elite in Haiti, people forget that Haiti has been independent for over 200 years. What have the elite done with that country? Why have they transitioned? The danger is that maybe some countries in Africa will never become fully open access societies. And the one will have to deal with that consequence. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that's it. The next speaker is Yoon Lee. Yoon is a program analyst for the Francophone region and advisor for the Off-Grid Energy Program. Yoon is directly responsible for the Senegal, Burkina Faso portfolios and provides support in the Francophone region, including Benin, Niger, Mali, Guinea, and Mauritania. Previously, Yoon served with the United States Peace Corps for a total of 7 years and as agroforestry extension agent, as a local government and NGO liaison, and as Peace Corps recruiter based in Oakland, California. So please join me in welcoming Yoon.
Thank you. Hello. So just to tie myself a little bit to the previous speakers, I feel like the focus of my own organization is actually encouraging economic growth and prosperity across Africa. But as Sylvia said, education is critical, as Dr. John talked about open access societies. Those are all critical things within the dialogue that we're all here to discuss. For us at the African Development Foundation, we really work to catalyze and empower local leaders and communities to build their own solutions. And essentially, within that kind of need, or the critical need for us, is responsible seed capital and refinancing. So we provide, as a grant organization, financing, seed capital, and investment for organizations on the African continent. We have formalized programs in over 20 countries across the continent, but also touching different areas depending on our kind of exterior funding, if you will. We are a government agency, but we do have partnerships with organizations like Citigroup, Foundation, GE, as well as different banks and associations and government ministries, depending on our host country. So with that, I think with responsible seed capital and financing, there's a lot of question as to how to keep organizations open, access, and accountable for these funding streams. I think that's been a consistent challenge, especially if you look at country structures and levels of conceivably corruption and just lack of transparency in general, just as John was discussing. But for us, we really do focus on working with people from where they are coming from, where they are. So they come to us with business plans, with ideas, with innovations that we try to support. It really depends on what they're coming at us with. We're pretty flexible, and we want everything to be coming from the people who are living, in their own situations. So essentially, the smallholder farmers, a lot of those farmers are within different types of organizational structures like cooperatives and unions. So within that part of our arm, if you will, we really encourage the building of their foundation, financial management systems, due process, as well as consistent elections and/or transparent processes to be implemented organization in order to develop and to expand productions, depending on what they're doing. We also finance young entrepreneurs. It doesn't have to be necessarily a large, kind of broader community entrepreneurship. It could be this amazing, innovative idea of connecting medical clinics across the region and exchanging supplies or having an understanding of where their resources are. It could be very simple technology using SMS texting and negotiating crop prices within, between two communities, or a middleman, if you will. But we also work on off-grid energy as an organization, originally linked with Power Africa Initiative, but now taking it on as our own off-grid energy kind of drive, if you will, to just basically enable our grantees and our entrepreneurs to be more self-reliant and to be able to increase production, whatever they're doing. So I think I'm being a bit generic in general, but at the same time, that's what we put out there, so that it is everything that we do is being derived from the communities that we serve. That's something that I carried with me from my Peace Corps experience, as well as focusing on participatory development as being kind of the foundation of everything, and people taking ownership of their facilities and their capacities, if you will. So essentially, we're trying to bridge the gap between smallholder farmers or young entrepreneurs to follow-on financing, or to international export markets, or regional national markets, just depending on their scope. So that's generally what we do. We're always, trying to be as responsible as possible and vigilant, because we are working on the taxpayer dollar, and we're very proud of what we do, because we do get a lot of bang for our buck, if you will, in influence, and also in just guiding people on the path to prosperity within the countries that we serve.
Thank you so very much. Question and answering period about your work. We love the fact that you involve the community in your decision making, and probably get a lot of program ideas from them as well. Our next speaker, I like to say that, Mr. Mighty Fine. Mighty Fine is the Director of Public Health Practice at the American Public Health Association, where he oversees APHA's public health practice efforts. I know that, thank you. Thank you so very much, Mr. Mighty Fine. In the interest of time, he really abbreviated his presentation, so we'll have some questions, Speaker. Mr. Millennium Challenge Fund Corporation in Washington, D.C. I suppose you're a program officer, or was a program officer with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Thank you so very much, sir. We invite you to give your presentation.
How much time do I have?
Sir?
How much time do I have?
You have exactly 3 minutes.
Okay, we can work with that.
Just so that we have about 10 minutes for questions.
My name is Malik M. Chaka. I am retired, and I say that loudly and proudly. I was director of threshold programs at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Millennium Challenge Corporation is a U.S. government development agency that is a small agency with a big impact. It was set up by Congress in 2004 and has since that time spent $15 to $16 billion in countries, in the poor countries of the world. The agency only works with low-income countries and lower middle-income countries. The mission of the agency is to reduce poverty through economic growth. If you look at our colleagues in USAID, for example, they do everything. they go from soup to nuts. Our focus is, in fact, singular: poverty reduction through economic growth. It's our intent to empower the poor, and we do this by investing in projects that provide electricity, clean water, roads, healthcare, that the poor need to lift themselves out of poverty. MCC is modernizing the fight against poverty through business-like approach in which decisions are based on hard data and rigorous analysis, and the results are monitored, measured, and publicly shared. The MCC investment is intended to catalyze private investment. At the end of the day, countries aren't going to develop based on government investment. The private sector has to be involved. They have to play the leading role in that process. And MCC catalyzes private investment for the public good by partnering with countries to enact market-based reforms and developing innovative public-private partnerships. As an example, MCC recently invested $5 billion in Benin, Ghana, and Jordan. As a result of this investment, you had private investment stepped up in its total of $1.1 billion. Another thing that's different about MCC, we work with a select group of countries. We say these are countries that rule justly, invest in people, and practice economic freedom. The MCC board is structured a little differently than many U.S. government agencies. We have a public-private board of directors that includes the Secretary of State, the MCC Chief Executive Officer, the Secretary of the Treasury, the U.S. Trade Representative, the USAID Administrator, and 4 members of the private sector. In the interest of time, I'm going to make one additional point before I wind up. MCC, when I say that they are selective, basically what I'm saying is that only a select group of countries can get assistance. And in order to do that, they must meet 3 criteria. They must pass a control the corruption indicator, that's part of our scorecard. They pass either political rights or civil liberties, and they pass half of the indicators overall. Approximately 1/5 of the countries on the African continent have benefited from MCC funding, and we have 2 product lines. We have compacts, which are large grants over a 5-year period of time, which have ranged from $60 million to almost $700 million. And we have thresholds, which are programs that are for countries that come close, they come to the threshold of meeting the requirements. But they have to carry out a series of policy reforms in order to be able to get themselves over the hurdle. I'll stop with this point.
I must tell you that, first of all, I want to congratulate MCC and the work that they've been able to do in Africa. I know that many countries now really try to meet your criteria in order to qualify, because you have a very strict process. And so it'll be interesting to hear more of the work and the future of MCC in this political climate as far as funding is concerned. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over straight to the audience. If you have some questions, there's some human rights issues here, there's some programmatic peace and development, there's a philosophical piece that our professor, Dr. of what bodes well for economic development in Africa. So we have a distinguished panel here. So let's take full benefit of them. So I'm going to open it up to the audience now if you have any questions for our distinguished panelists. Ms. Barton?
Did qualify for MCC grants. What are they doing right? Any pattern of those particular countries that you can identify? And was there anybody who got an MCC grant and then no longer did because they didn't meet the criteria any longer? So
Because they acted
question,
up.
2 parts.
Yeah. Excellent question. We hold regular elections. Do they, in fact, make a concerted effort to hold the line on corruption? When I say invest in people, do they spend money on things like education and health as opposed to military spending or white elephant projects? So it's those countries, and you'll find countries that do well on certain parts of our scorecard, but they don't do well on, for example, controlling corruption.
I want to just add something on that because I recall that you guys are one of the few programs that not only people put countries on, but you're quick to take them off. When Yahya Gammar, for example, with the Gambia, they were on, and you guys found it fit to take him off.
2005.
2005.
As a matter of fact. January 2006, and someone said to me, said, "Isn't it wonderful?" I said, "What?" He said, "You work on Africa, right?" I said, "Yes." And we just given the Gambia a compact. Oh, they're eligible for compact. Isn't that wonderful? I said, "Oh, no." I said, "It isn't." I said, "What I can guarantee you is that in a relatively short period of time, Mr. Jammeh is going to get bounced for human rights violations."
Right.
So I knew that this was an accident waiting to happen. We also have a suspension policy.
Yeah.
And so we hold folks' feet to the fire.
Right. I tell you another selling point to you guys' program. It has not been politicized. For whatever reason, it has not been associated with any one president per se.
No, in fact,
Can you speak
one
on
of the
that?
things that I would point out, you have some people that I would call donor darlings, where people literally chase them to give them
Right.
money. And at one time, Mr. Museveni in Uganda was a donor darling. And they had a threshold program, which was a smaller amount of money, but they never got to the compact.
Right.
Because they couldn't hold the line on corruption. They would pass one year and not pass the other. And I used to tell people, I said, you know, I can feel good when I get up in the morning, because if U.S. was, the MCC was providing money to countries that violate human rights, or where there's a kleptocracy, I said I would find it a little difficult to stomach. They don't. And you've also found situations, for example, where countries where there wasn't a major U.S. support to, based on their scores on our scorecard, became MCC countries. And I would point, for example, to a Niger. I would point to a Benin. I would point to a Burkina Faso.
Right.
Because the U.S. had this idea is that the Francophone countries, that's the business of the French.
Of the French, absolutely.
With the exception of Senegal, which has always
Right.
had a great relationship.
So I'm going to hold you there for a minute. Yes, sir. You have a question?
Yes. My question is, as you know, for some countries are not really willing to do any improvements when it comes to democracy and governance. The example is like even my country, Rwanda, you remember them rejecting MCC, saying it's okay, this is too much, we don't want to do anything you are asking for. Now my question is, for the US government, there is that development aid you can provide through MCC, but on the other hand, when countries are rejecting MCC as a sign of not really willing to do any improvements, so what is your advice, or maybe your idea when it comes to doing that, especially when they continue to get the US government funding? So does it really make sense? Don't you see that kind of contradiction between them rejecting the values and principles of democracy and governance, but on the other hand, continue to be beneficiaries of economic growth, which is not likely to happen because those guys really are not really committed to any kind of the basic principles that everybody may wish them to have.
Okay, we gotta stop there. Go ahead.
They didn't get $300 million over a 5-year period of time. The Brits continue to love them.
Right.
U.S. gives them lots and lots and lots of assistance.
Other types of.
Yeah. MCC is not going to do that. And I think that this schizophrenia in the U.S. government, where USAID gives you money, but MCC, I think is good.
Yeah.
Because MCC is in fact drawn a certain kind of line. And it's fine for a country to say, we don't want your money.
So let me have others chime in a little bit. So for example, on the African development, in countries where MCC is not.
Yeah, and actually, for example, Rwanda, that was originally under my portfolio when I first started with the agency, so I can speak to it a bit. It is interesting because originally in Rwanda, our program's been there, I think, since...
Oh, and I'm going to invite you guys to speak a little bit closer to the mic, please,
Sure.
only because...
I'm sorry.
Oh, yes.
So our program in Rwanda has been active for a number of years, and we have been invited by the government of Rwanda to have a specialized programmatic presence there. We've been working predominantly in larger cooperatives and unions of either coffee, tea, or actually textiles and manufacturing and food processing in Rwanda for some time. With our original, I guess in our terms, not compact, but agreement, MOU, we actually did have a strategic partnership with, I believe it was the Ministry of Agriculture. But then actually our strategic partnership, it was interesting. It was a really interesting conversation because they didn't want to have that partnership anymore because we were giving grants, if you will. They said, if you give loans, then we'll be in agreement. They were very hard-lined on their own kind of values and proposition.
And that's not necessarily bad.
No, no, absolutely not.
Because they take ownership for it, it's sustainable over time, hopefully,
Absolutely.
and maybe at another point, they'll be ready and at the stage of development for that type of program. But I want to give Malik just an opportunity, not Malik, I apologize, Mr. Mighty Fine, an opportunity to talk about what are the opportunities for partnership with your organization on the continent, and the role that it can play in development. Just in terms of closing, I know he has a hard stop to go, but I want to continue the conversation maybe just for like 5 more minutes, if you guys don't mind, even if a few speakers may have to leave.
Yeah, I would say for APHA, I think sometimes for international groups it may be a deterrent because we are the American Public Health Association. But as I mentioned before, we do have touch points with the global community. So particularly through our work with the World Federation of Public Health Associations, as I think was mentioned on the previous panel, sometimes you need to work to make sure the infrastructure in the country can support democracy and all that comes with it. And I think that's what you can look to APHA for, not necessarily using our framework as a model, but some of the countries that we've partnered with and we have deep-seated relationships with, as I mentioned before, and here we call it advocacy. In those countries, we may call it something a little bit differently.
So, Mr. Fine, how do you get started? A country, for example, like Rwanda says, listen, we're interested in setting up a process with you or getting into an agreement with you. How does that work?
We usually, if the country, for us, it's easier if the country has a public health association. So we do like a twinning program. So we build capacity in their public health association, and if they don't have one currently, then we assess whether or not that is a possibility within that country, and then work through the Ministry of Health and the Public Health Association.
That's it. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you
you're
very
so
much.
welcome.
So before I go into Sylvia, if you would, Dr. Muller, what are you hearing? You're hearing that there is the MCC, there's a compact, among other different programmatic areas that they could cover. There are certain requirements that they look for in terms of transparency, governance, investments in education, health, and what have you. You also have the African Development Foundation basically saying, hey, we work with the country to develop what the actual strategy for that country is going to be. It's going to be homegrown. And of course, you have human rights issues over here. So,
Yeah, of course, any number of things can trigger development in society.
if you could bring the mic just
Any
closer.
number of factors can trigger development in society or even stagnation. Outside intervention can be positive. Whatever goes in, if it's helping the humans to live in that society, in my books, that is positive. But in the long-term horizon, you've got to ask yourself, what does, like Rutwanda will tell us, what does history teach us? Unless it's endogenous, unless it's coming from within, then you can have all these exogenous interventions, and they may work for a time, but they will not deliver you to where you want to be. And again, you look to Western Europe as an example. Portugal and Spain, for years, they stagnated. Why? It's not because they were far away from the developed countries of Europe. They're right next door to France, to whatever, but they were just going nowhere for actually a number of hundreds of years. So what happened in the end that brought about these changes that spurred development, and now Portugal and Spain are progressing at what we call a European Union pace of development. What made the change possible? You have to look at the internal factors. And I think some countries, people wonder, for example, that Kenya goes through a lot of these political cycles of instability, but somehow the economy does not, it suffers to a degree, but not to the degree that suffers in other places. And the secret of the Kenya success, I keep telling people, relative success, is the strong regime of private property and some degree of respect for it. So that the elite may bill for public resources, but they are not going to go the Rwanda route of taking somebody's resources and auctioning them. They don't do that, so that people can,
Well, just some positives. I understand, in fact, I know of about 2 or 3 young Microsoft techies that actually live in Microsoft and actually going to Kenya to participate in this tech boom that's taking place over there, so you never know. Now, Sylvia, when we talk about Africa, we talk about economic growth. We always seem to talk about human rights. And some people say, well, we have to take that measure and what have you. What is the human rights implication as a positive for development? Or another way of saying it, can we do economic growth in Africa in the absence of not having a strong human rights record?
I think it's a very complicated and very nuanced situation. It really is a little bit of the chicken and the egg kind of thing, where you don't want to give money to places where there aren't human rights, but on the same time, if you don't give any money, you don't give any development support, you tend to not have human rights it tends to get worse. So it's a very difficult situation. And that's why our program, for instance, is sending it to the people from inside the community. It's got to come from, as you said, it's got to come, as the doctor said here, it's got to come from the local indigenous people, and it's got to come from them. And part of that is, if you're starving, you're not going to be too worried about other people's rights at that moment because you're starving. So it becomes a real, how do you handle this? And part of it is great, things like the program that if they're human rights violators, they don't get the money. So it does, I think that kind of external pressure from the U.S. and from other countries does need to happen.
Right.
That the more human rights are respected, the more money you're going to get, the more support you're going to get. That's going to make people then start to push in human rights because that's going to help them get their money. So I think they are very closely related, and but it's just not a super simple answer, unfortunately.
Indeed. Now, before we have just closing remarks from our panelists, I just want to open up for one more question out of the audience, if you have one more question for the panelists. No more questions? Being that we've beaten you guys. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Are they loans or direct investment managed by themselves and the natives? Are they the money they put in Africa? Are they direct investment managed by them and the people, or their loans advanced to the countries?
Okay. So, gentleman raises a very good point because, as we know, millions set aside for development in Africa. But what's been found is that a lot of the money doesn't actually get released. And if they do, oftentimes, they're shared to American companies working in the continent. And so the question is, does that money actually get to investment partners locally in country?
If
I may paraphrase.
hop in here. For our portfolios that we support, cooperatives, unions, they have to be 100% African owned.
Wow.
100%. Not even someone, not even someone on board of directors or anything affiliated can be foreign, even from a neighboring country on the African continent.
Can they be diaspora?
Unfortunately, no. Citizenship, we actually confirm and do our due diligence and background checks for that. So that's one thing that's essential for our program.
Is that a good policy, though? Say I'm a fellow from Guinea, here at the school in the U.S. I got a top flight technical education. I want to go back home now, and I want to invest along with my Guinean brethren. But you're saying that you couldn't.
If they're a citizen of the country that we were funding, then we could fund them, but
they cannot be American, Guinean.
No, that's part of our original act as the African Development Foundation.
What I would say to you is look at the role played by overseas Chinese.
Yeah.
Or
Indians.
Might be or Indians.
Yeah.
It's something that you might want to look at.
Yeah, it's called The New Argonauts. Actually, it's a wonderful book on that. But I do understand because again, sometimes different funding geared towards different demographic.
And our focus is very much kind of the baseline shareholder farmers and the feeders into different.
What's the
value
biggest funding that you donate or that you to an individual?
Sure. For basically, we can start with what we call capacity building grants, depending on the facilities and just structures within an organization. We might start with about $50,000 worth of training and capacity building, procedures manuals, developments, etc.
Training that keeps
and then exactly, and then 50,000 of conceivably working capital of equipment, infrastructure, etc. seed capital. And if they provide, a good, I guess, project, if you will, in business business plan moving forward in that 2-year process with that initial grant, that they could graduate to a $250,000 some
Well,
dollar.
you'll be happy to know that probably about 1994, 95, 1993, 94, when Nisafor Soglo in Benin from Kirikou, or that the USAID, we funded the first Benin Indigenous Strengthening Project, and it was training of NGOs at the time, professionalizing them, around 50 of them, and we're happy to say that there's been a lot of growth and development as a result of that project, so we're excited about it. Now, Shaka, MCC.
MCC, grants, not loans. So
That's what
in excess of $600 million over a 5-year period of time in Tanzania.
Right.
It wasn't a loan to be paid back, it was a grant.
Right, right. Well, I keep saying that you guys are one of the biggest hidden secrets, and you've managed to not become political. But the other aspect of it is you have advisory, people who are very well respected, who actually are part of your decision making in terms of funding, in terms of countries that gets on. So that might be a winning piece of it as well.
We have what we call accountable entities.
Gotcha.
Which is the group within a country that in fact runs the program. We might have 3 people on a permanent basis inside the country. The entity that spends the money, that builds the road, that drills for the water, is in fact a local entity.
Private or government?
It's
Or quasi or both?
quasi. The
Gotcha.
government,
Because the government signs the compact, correct?
yeah,
Okay.
but it's separate from government.
Gotcha.
Many times we've used country systems, like financial systems in
Right.
some places, but they had to meet certain standards. So a
Okay.
place like Cape Verde, which has excellent government systems, we were able to use their Ministry of Finance
Right.
or their procurement entity. In places where we can't, and that's the majority of the places on the African continent at present,
Yeah.
we set up an entity that's local, but not governmental.
So as we prepare for our final statements, wrap up, I would love to have Dr. of your program. But I would love to see your evaluation piece at some point. I know you have it probably on the website.
We do performance evaluation.
Performance evaluation, absolutely.
And we probably do
So
as
speak,
many impact evaluations.
talk on that as you,
US government.
your closing remarks. We'll leave the last for you, Mr. Shaka, because I know you have a lot, and I just want to comment on your program. Or was there a question? Okay, go ahead, sir, from Rwanda.
By the landed gentry, who did not necessarily like this appropriation of their property. Now the same concept was extended later on when the business class grew and they partook of the same rights, and later on the working class partook of those rights, and so forth and so on. And that's how the space in Britain was gradually opened until it became fully accessible, really, to the majority of the people, and without necessarily going through a violent revolution. That was luck, maybe, I don't know. They didn't go the route of France or other European countries to achieve what they achieved.
Okay, so as we watch democracy grow, we have one more question.
Thank you. My question is Yun Lee. She made a comment about the government of Rwanda preferring to get loans instead of grants when it comes to funding maybe some kind of local organizations. But I may have missed something, because I want to understand what is the government rationale when it comes to preferring loans. Because from what I know, in many cases people prefer to get grants, because grants means you will not pay back.
Yeah.
So what was the reason behind that kind of thinking?
Yeah. No, that's a very good question, and actually, if I had that answer, we probably would still have it was actually, I had structured our program as a loan-based program, and it would be still continuing. But I think mainly the reasoning was the country plan, the 2020 country plan that actually designates a certain heavier concentration on international loan basis as opposed to grants. But for our own purposes, and this is actually going to be part of my closing remarks, if you will, in light of that, because there are many conversations happening like that across the continent, I think it's very valid where people don't necessarily, they feel more empowered by actually a loan or the ability to get a loan on their own grit, if you will. And what we do as an organization is try to build up groups in order to get to that next step, if you will, to provide financial management training in order to have 2 to 3 years of audit trail in order to actually apply for a substantive loan at the bank that they can indeed pay off, as well as have exterior or additional funds and revenues to save and reinvest. So one of our things with our organization is that return on investment is extremely important. So even though we are grant structured, the organizations always have to show that the return on investment will be there, that they can either double or triple what we will be putting in so that they can reinvest it within their organization. And that's something that we've actually presented to the Rwandan ministries, and now the Ministry of Agriculture is very interested in partnering with us once again because of that focus on follow-on and growth.
So as you continue to build on your closing remarks, watch democracy grow in Africa. Your prognosis for the future?
Oh gosh. Starting at the baseline, having those conversations directly with the people you're working with. We're very, very much at that grassroots level. When I go to the field, we are with our farmers, we're with our producers, peeling pineapples and juicing mangoes. It's really, you have to start at the baseline and make sure that people have the skills and the information, the education, the knowledge for them.
Thank you. Okay, Sylvia, the floor is yours. Building on democracy for the future in Africa and human rights and the wonderful work that you continue to do.
Absolutely. As I said, the right to democracy is actually in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which almost all countries, I'd have to look, I think, but probably every country in Africa is signed on to. So it really is getting to the people, getting to the grassroots, getting to the farmers, the people juicing the vegetables and so on, to really get them to know that this is something that they can do, that they have a right to do, and communicating that, helping them with education, helping them with ideas, helping the youth with ideas. How does this fit in your village? How does this fit in your society? Not that somebody else is telling them what to do, but these are your rights. How can you do this peacefully? Again, emphasis on peace. So I think that building that grassroots support for having education and having the youth understanding and respecting their own rights, I think is going to help build democracy, because you have to have that education too.
So, Professor Mueller, you're going to build an image for us, and we're going to give you about 7 minutes. Only because we're going to wait for Mr. Shaka to come back. So you have the floor. If you could conjure up, because he's going to be the last statement, but I want you to conjure up something that's very thought-provoking. Imagining a future of Africa different than it really is today. Its boundaries, its ethnic challenges, its unique opportunities in terms of its tremendous resources that it may not be leveraging correctly. How would that look like for us as Africa grows?
Yeah, basically,
You can even stand up if you want to.
No, if Africa really does get a threshold where it begins to transition,
Louder for us.
if Africa does reach that threshold where it begins, or many African countries, some are almost close, getting certain institutional frameworks right,
Okay.
opening up this, farming up the
So
rules.
focus sector by sector
For
for us.
example, the principal thing is the institutional framework.
Mhm.
And once you create that, once you have the basics, the judiciary, the rest, working as they should, I don't think the government has really much business in going to this other subsectors. Just get this thing, get the framework and develop the norms
Gotcha.
of respecting, the rules as they have been established.
Yes, sir.
And from that on, you create what they call in development circles, path dependence. Once you create a proper path, it's self-perpetuating almost. You have the rule of law, and then I don't have to second guess anybody. If I'm bringing in money to invest, I just know, okay, this is how the system works.
Right.
If I have any conflict to resolve, to the judicial branch and so forth. And that kind of, it builds on itself, and society moves on. But
Let me ask you a question. Here in the United States, there's a requirement for you to disclose your wealth as you go into office.
Right.
Let's get, I think, a clean bill when you leave. There's been reportedly some resistance to doing that in Africa. Heads of state or individuals taking on political elected positions. Is that something that should be a requirement of all elected officials?
At the moment now, it's almost unrealistic, given the nature of the politics in the African continent, which is patronage based.
Right.
All these people, they're hiding. They don't want to disclose them, but it's like you're kind of buying yourself to your opponents. Because you tell them how much you have so they can size you up. Because you need to hide your resources because you're going to go to the battlefield and that's your arsenal.
Right.
That's your money. You're going to buy followers. So you don't announce it beforehand.
So it's not possible to do that in the context of Africa?
In the context of African politics at the moment is unrealistic. Or they'll probably get some form announcements.
The front end, what can you do on the back end?
Create, you have to create confidence.
Right.
Slowly, and this will take time. You create a system whereby you know that this system is open, it works.
Right.
But I don't need, for these people to clear their words, whatever. If in an open access system, can I get these records from the income tax department?
Okay, so you're going to have two of it. You meant to focus on just what you want. But President Trump, some people say that he is somewhat of an enigma as it pertains to a relationship with Africa. That a Trump relationship is actually one of the best relationships that we've had in almost 2 decades.
It's by default. One thing, I don't think Trump is concerned about many things, including Africa.
Right.
But by kind of stepping back and not, because there's also dangers to micromanagement, being in your face all the time, it almost backfires. I bet you President Trump doesn't know how many countries there are on the continent and he doesn't care, which is a good thing. Because the Africans should also...
But he said a lot of his friends make millions of dollars.
Yeah, that he knows. So, but he knows, but he's not one of, but he knows there's something going on there that can make you wealthy. And Africans should take this as as a point, something positive. Because there's sometimes busybodies, too many cooks, don't necessarily prepare the best meal.
Okay.
So
as you make your closing remarks for Mr. Shaka? Okay, Mr. Shaka, we talked about MCC and a lot of people don't know about it. It's a tremendous opportunity. You guys actually oversee a tremendous amount of money. Some of it are done with certain requirements in terms of governance. And again, we also said that you guys have managed to stay below the radar as far as the politics. As you prepare to answer your telephone or if you could tell us, number one, why do you think MCC is such a good partner, a good opportunity for countries in Africa who see fit to meet the requirements, and take full advantage of it. Give us an example of one of your success stories and tell us what you think the future of MCC is.
First of all, what I would say is that MCC is free money.
Repeat a little bit louder for the mic did not catch that, please.
First thing I would say is that MCC is free money. It's a grant, not a loan.
Right.
The second thing that I would say, the requirements that MCC calls for are the same kind of requirements that would make a country successful in attracting investment. Investors want to know, will they be able to repatriate profits, for example? Is there stability in the country? Earlier, someone said something about, I think it was my brother here, he was talking about Portugal and Spain.
Yes.
What happened with Portugal and Spain, which at one time had divided up the world, was that they became authoritarian places. And it was only after the demise of Franco and the doing away with the corporate state in Portugal that they began to attract investment, the economies began to grow.
Yes, sir.
If you go back to 1974 in Portugal, in northern parts of the country, people were cooking outside on fires. 50% of the people were illiterate at that point in time. So I think the other thing about MCC is it creates a private sector environment. Anybody who thinks that foreign assistance is going to help them to get, is the key to getting out of poverty, they have another thing coming.
Right.
They have another thing coming.
Continue speaking to the mic, please, because we want to capture very nuggets of information. And as you bring it home.
Well, for MCC, the question of what will there be at MCC tomorrow?
Right.
One of the questions that people ask, they say, well, what would be the attitude of Mr. Trump
Right.
About MCC? And what I would say there is that MCC has broad bipartisan support. And it was in fact initially a Republican initiative. Now it's embraced by everyone. And the other thing that MCC has going for it is that it's a relatively small amount of money. If they are spending, for example, $55 billion a year in assistance, non-military assistance, MCC is only about 900 million, between 900 million and $1 billion a year.
Well, thank you very much. This has been and I hope we can continue in the hall somewhere. But please, folks, join me in thanking this wonderful distinguished panel.